So hello and welcome. I am Chris and this is Michael, and I'm the head coach at the Endurance Edge, as well as lead dietitian and exercise physiologist. And this is Michael. He is also a registered dietitian. And if you do any metabolic testing or sweat testing here, you likely will get it done with Michael. Also happens to be a mechanic. So hopefully we'll be bringing you two different kind of perspectives on training with power. So welcome to our introduction to training with power. And yeah, ready to jump in?
Let's do
and
it.
both of us happen to be cyclists.
Yep.
So, you know, we like to talk about the things that we like to do.
Yeah.
So, all right, so what are we going to learn today? I hate jumping into webinars and not knowing what the heck I'm going to learn. So this is our intention. So we're going to define power. Seems pretty basic, right? Well, you would be surprised. And then also, okay, cool. So we're going to describe how power can actually help you improve. I mean, that's kind of the point of why you're here, is that we're helping you to reach and sustain peak performance and health. That is our mission. All right, what else are we going to learn? So there are some requirements to using power. It's not just like suddenly it magically appears. There's a little homework and a little money you got to spend. So we want to make sure that you guys are clear on that. List what kinds of power meters are on the market. That is really where Michael is going to shine and talking about all the different stuff, because honestly, as a coach, I want to see what's on the back end. I want to analyze the software. I want to help you out as an athlete, but then I have to send you to Michael to make sure you do your, like, all of your stuff is set up properly. And I feel like that's a big issue for people, which is why we have Michael.
Yeah.
And then describing briefly what different numbers are the most relevant during your actual training and or racing. And then the important stuff to analyze afterwards. We will probably make a couple more webinars getting a little bit more into the nitty-gritty numbers, because there are so many stinking acronyms. It's like worse than the military when it comes, and it's total overkill. So I don't want you guys to be overwhelmed. I want you to use this tool to have fun and to enjoy the sport. Okay, so what is power? Pretty simple, y'all. Assuming that you guys can see that. It's direct, real-time measurement of the work that you're doing on the bike. No other tool can do that we know of yet. So this is actual, real data that you're getting. So let me just make ourselves a little bit smaller here. You guys probably don't see the difference, but anyhow. So as I'm saying this, so there's no other tool. We do have heart rate. That is certainly a tool, but think of power being an external load and heart rate being an internal response. So there is a lag time. Heart rate, in order to reach steady state, you have to be going at the same intensity for approximately 2 minutes, which is why if you do metabolic testing with us, you'll be doing a stage test for at least 3 minutes. We kind of want that extra minute in there kind of as bonus to make sure that you've leveled out. Heart rate also has some other issues that go along with it. So it's affected by the heat, it's affected by altitude, it's affected by hydration, it's affected by stress. How much sleep did you get? Caffeine, like the list goes on and on and on. I'm not saying that heart rate is not important. I'm just saying that power will tell it like it is. There is no way to fudge this number at all. Other things, so just FYI, we do use power and we use heart rate zones in our metabolic testing. If you do the training zones and fueling formula with us, I find it important from a coaching perspective to use both. So I want to see, especially if something is happening either with the heart rate monitor not reading right, but power works, or power's not reading right, heart rate works. So having the two together is critical from my perspective. Speed, pace depends on many factors. So if you have a speedometer on your bike, which is great, like, oh, well, I can hold a 17-mile-per-hour pace. I can hold a 29-mile-per-hour pace, or whatever the heck you're doing. So can you be using not a lot of power when you're doing 30 miles an hour?
Yeah. If you're going downhill,
yeah,
or you have a tailwind. Right.
Or you're in a draft, or, you know, I mean, so speed honestly is very arbitrary. And when people are like, oh, I can hold an X, 17 miles an hour pace, I'm like, that's great. That means nothing to me. So I want to
know. Or like if you go out in like a headwind and like you're doing like a long ride into a headwind, it's like you may look at the end of it and like your average speed was 16 miles an hour, but your average power was 300 watts or something.
Right.
You know, if it's like, so it's like you said, speed is not necessarily a good indicator of like intensity.
Not at all. So that is power is the true measure of your intensity. So a speedometer is totally different. And let's also take the case of, so my sport of choice now is mountain biking. Depending on the course, 6 miles per hour might be a really good day for me. And if you told a road biker that, they'd be like, I'm sorry, were you crawling?
Yeah.
It's like, no, I was working my intensity factor, and we'll get into that a little bit later, was, 1.15. Like that's a legit ride for me personally. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that. Okay. Now let's get a little technical. Power's equation is torque times cadence. So basically, torque is that twisting force that you're applying to be able to move yourself forward. That is actually what the power meter is measuring, the tension and anyway.
So most of the power meters have like a strain gauge, and so what it's actually detecting is like that twisting shear force, which kind of helps make power make more sense. Because if you think about like a pedal, when you're pedaling hard, what it's essentially doing is measuring the amount of like deflection in those materials, like the amount of flexing and bending. So, and they kind of like use all kinds of equations to figure out what that is in like watts that you're putting out.
That you're producing.
Yeah.
Also consider that the majority of effort that you are putting into making your bike go forward is lost. So hooray.
Yeah.
But that's kind of another story. But anyway, so just so you understand that torque, and then of course cadence is your revolutions per minute. How many times are you actually turning the pedals over? So, if we just use simple algebra here, power, torque, and cadence, we could have, high cadence, high torque, high power, low torque, high cadence, etc. Right? So just so you have an understanding of what that is. Okay, so what makes power so stinking awesome? Because it really, truly is awesome. Because cycling performance is heavily dependent on how fit you are. Whether you are mountain biking, whether you're gravel riding, whether you're in a crit, whether you're in a road race, it doesn't matter. You could argue that there is some level of technique that is involved in any of those things.
For sure.
But by and large, it is fitness. And the stronger you are from a power perspective, the better of an athlete, better cyclist you'll be. If you can use it correctly, and if you have context to it, which I'll talk about here, it is one of the fastest ways to improve your fitness, hands down. So that's why we love power. So it gives you those full objective measurements. Like, again, the power does not lie. Full objective measurements of your fitness, not only for you, but also if you're working with a coach, for somebody like me to be able to look and analyze and see how you're improving. Okay, so we use that, just like I said before, we use our metabolic testing to be able to create heart rate training zones and power training zones. And in our workouts, not only in the workouts that I create on the software that we use, but also in the way that we program it for each individual athlete, you'll see that there are two pieces. You'll have zones for heart rate and zones for power. And again, one might sort of trump the other depending on what you're trying to achieve. And then it depends on your goals. If you are a half Ironman, I have a lot of half Ironman athletes right now. If you're a half Ironman athlete, then your goals are going to be a little bit different than somebody who's training for crits, for example, or a mountain biker. So that is all in the programming and the way that you use power and the zones that you use. As a side note for that, on zones, there are some, if I should put a slide in here, you guys would probably vomit on just the different amounts of zones that are out there.
Ways of like defining zones.
Correct.
Yeah.
We only have so many exercise, from an exercise physiology standpoint, we only have so many energy systems. That's just how it is. So when we get so many of these different zones, it's just far overwhelming. Like I've seen zone 4, for example, broken down into A, B, C, D, and E. Like that's insane. I've seen 9 zones. I've seen.
And it just becomes like a lot of like burden on like the athlete to keep track of that. Because like if you're a coach and you program someone like all right, so this interval is going to be at 4C, and I need you back down to 4B. Like that's a lot for someone to remember.
It is a lot. It's easier to do from a power perspective. It's harder to do from a heart rate perspective. But it's just, then it's just not as fun.
Yeah.
And the body also responds to averages. So when you're getting like super nitpicky and breaking it all down so much, like how is the body responding? So we want to make sure that we've got that good internal response too, and then you're getting enough nutrition and rest and sleep and all those other things. Anyway, so okay. Another thing from the objective measurement perspective, from a power perspective, is that we use it for pace predictions. If you want to super nerd out, and I think I talk about this later, there's a program called Best Bike Split, which you could literally put in your height, weight, gender, the weight of your bike, what kinds of tires you're using, what kinds of rims you're using, I mean, like what kind of pavement there is, and it goes super, super nitpicky and can actually give you some level of prediction. I've had athletes use it before, and sometimes it works, and sometimes life can throw curveballs at you, like a rainstorm that comes in the middle of a race or something like that. So try to kind of keep it reasonable as much as you can, but that's a nice opportunity for me to use. From my perspective, I like using percent of FTP and then guiding athletes as a percentage for what race they're doing and then how much experience they have in the sport. So we'll get more into that here later. Power meter considerations. Here's where Michael really comes in. So you have to decide on a budget. There are many options. What, from your perspective, can athletes spend in terms of?
Yeah, I mean,
what's the most budget option?
Things like stages tend to be more budget friendly. Stages makes so you can get left side crank arms. So it just measures power on the left side and then kind of averages it out to a guesstimation of both sides. But they also make like a two-sided one, so that one's going to be more expensive because you have multiple gauges. That's really where the expense is in those like little sensors. But
have you seen that is what most people are buying?
The single-sided or double-sided? We see a mix. Honestly, we see a really good mix. I would say now that the single-sided options have come out, you see more people buying that because most people have, like, there's a slight right-left discrepancy because like most people have like a dominant side, so like you're going to probably be able to put out a little bit more power. But for most people, it's the budget thing. Just like they want to be able to train with power, but not spend as much as the two-sided would cost. So I mean, like with stages, they make them in a variety of crank arms as well. So they've got like lower end crank arms, which are going to be cheaper. So I mean, you can get into the power game for a few $100, and then you could spend as much as a couple thousand.
Cha-ching. Yeah, easily. You can get like different head units like color coded, and trust me, it looks amazing. But anyway, so consider your budget. How many bikes are you going to put this on? So for example, I just had an athlete this past weekend who did her long ride, and she's a triathlete. She did her long ride on her cross bike, and she was like, man, I didn't go as far, but I worked really hard. But honestly, I have no idea how hard she worked because there's no power meter on her cross bike. So, as much as I love to make athletes buy things, it's nice to have. That way we can truly measure what was the load, what was the training stress of that workout. Is she getting enough rest following that? And how hard did she really work? Really the only thing I had to go off of is heart rate. And sometimes if you have wrist-based heart rate, it can be finicky in the cold. And as we're recording this right now, it's hot. So sometimes they can just be a little finicky. So anyway, consider how many bikes you have. I mean, in a perfect world, I'd love, if you're riding them all, I'd love one on each one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the cool thing. And that's one of the conversations we have with people trying to sell or like talking to them about power meters, like those options, is like, how many bikes do you want to be able to read power on? So like if you are training on, like if you're a triathlete and you're training on your tri bike, you do some road riding, like go to the mountains and stuff, and want to be able to have power. And if you also ride your cross bike, like looking at options that you can interchange between each of those bikes fairly easily. And that is the thing, like power meters, there's some options which can't really be changed from bike to bike as easily, and there's others that can be changed from bike to bike very easily.
And like in my case, from a mountain bike perspective, like I'm not going to put pedals on it. That would be silly. So it would have to be more of like a crank arm or a spider kind of option. So considering those types of things. I know some people, like especially my super data heads, get like really wrapped up in like a couple of watts difference. Like, again, the body responds to averages.
And I think that's one of those things people talk about that all the time, is which one's the most accurate, and like they're all within like a certain percent of like reproducibility.
Yes.
And that's what really matters, is like, okay, this power meter may read 50 watts lower than this one, but if it consistently reads 50 watts lower, that's all that matters.
Right. It's like the scale, your scale at home.
Yeah. As long as you're doing all of your testing to figure out like your FTP, which you may talk about this later. Like if you're like doing all your testing on that power meter, then like all of your zones are built off of that power meter, and all your training like readings are from that power meter. So like, that's all that matters.
Yes.
And any of the ones that you're going to find on the market are going to be like, I think they say like within 3% or 1.5%.
It's gotten really low.
Like they're all really good.
Yeah. So and also consider, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later too, you cannot compare athlete to athlete, like apples to apples, just based on watts. I mean, unless it's ridiculous, like a pro tour rider, spitting out hundreds of watts versus, me, just average me.
I mean, you can, like you said, you can't really totally compare, but you kind of can. Yes. But like, if it's like within like 50 watts, it's like that could be variation due to other things. But like if someone's FTP is 600 watts higher than yours, like that's probably not just the power meter.
Yeah. No.
Or at that point it might be.
Yes. So also consider what you want to get out of this, your goals. Again, are you training for Ironman? Are you training for cycling? Like, what are you trying to do with it? Are you going to ride across the country? Yeah, I don't know.
You just want to see your power numbers.
Do you just want to geek out and see your power numbers? That's cool too. So, consider what you want to get out of it. Consider your mechanical ability. And on that note, I feel like I have some level of mechanical ability, but I have no time. So I bought my power meter in September. And I didn't get it installed until like January, because it literally sat in the box. And all I needed to go was go out to the shed and get one little simple tool and change it. And I didn't. So very sad.
Don't be like Chris.
No.
If you're going to buy it, go ahead and put it on your bike.
Yes, exactly. Use it. Also consider your technological ability. So how good are you at syncing different things and getting different devices to talk to each other? And if you feel like your technological ability is lower, then to have that conversation with the salesperson.
And some of it's, some of it you can set up, like within each of the options, you can set it up to be more less technologically heavy. Mm-hmm. Like on, if you have like a head unit, you can set it to just read very simple numbers. Like you don't have to have the nuanced numbers that like you may not understand. And like you can set things up to make it a little bit easier for you to run. Like, so maybe you're not super technologically savvy, but you still want to train with power. Like you can kind of facilitate some of that. You may just have to have some outside help to get that set up.
Yes, correct. Okay, and consider your personality. We, as you might imagine here, have a lot of super type A people, and you might be one of them, and that's totally cool. So some people are just like total data nuts. They have to collect absolutely everything all the time, and that's completely fine. But if you're like, I don't even know what to do with it, then make that call in terms of what you actually put on your bike. So okay, different types of power meters. There are a ton on the market, lots of different options. So the Hub is, what Michael was just saying, they're kind of out.
Well, they still kind of exist, but like that's starting to become like an antiquated version, because now with bikes like adopting like disc brakes and through axles and stuff, like it's not as interchangeable like it used to be. Like the appeal of the wheel used to be that you could move it from bike to bike and it would work. Mm-hmm. But now it's like your cross bike might have through axles and disc brakes, but your road bike might be rim brake and quick release and and then even within through axle, there's multiple different standards, and so it's just like it's less becoming like it's not as much the option where you could just like swap out really easily that it used to be.
Yes, those tend to be one of the more expensive options, just FYI. But crank arm, I feel like is a very good affordable option, especially if you go the single-sided option. There's Stages, there's Rotor, there's Pioneer. This is not an all-inclusive list.
These are like some of the more major brands.
Yes. So what else do we have? You put it in your Spider. So
it's like the piece that attaches to the right crank arm, which
Right.
then the chain ring's attached to.
Right. And then your pedals. A lot of my athletes use Garmin, so if they are looking for a very affordable option, the single-sided pedal option from Garmin is a nice balance. The other nice part about that is that if they have a Garmin, everything just communicates nicely.
Yeah.
It's just
Very
nice to have
seamless integration.
It is. So especially for the non-technological person, I think that that's a really good option. And just FYI, we talked about the single or the double options, and there is more technology coming out, like power in your footbed, and the list goes on, I'm sure. So you got a lot of different options. If that's overwhelming to you, talk to your local favorite bike shop person. Don't let them intimidate you. Ask lots of questions. I've gone shopping with people. I love that job.
I think that's the other thing is, like, if you're thinking about some of these things, go ahead and go talk to like your mechanic and stuff to make sure everything's compatible. Like the pedal system's compatible with any bike because the pedal standard for bikes is the same for every crank, pretty much regardless of what kind of crank you have. But some of these others, like if you go with a crank based or a crank arm based, like there may be compatibility issues, like you may not be able to fit that crank arm on your crank, so you may have to explore other options.
Right.
Or if you get a crank base like a cork, you may have to change out the bottom bracket on your bike. So there's like compatibility things that you have to think about, and like if you're familiar with that stuff, cool, go for it. But if you're not familiar, don't just like start popping off and ordering stuff without making sure it'll work.
That's a bit, yeah, especially, I mean, we see a lot of these local shops, being hurt by some of the online businesses, and I get that you'll probably get it cheaper somewhere else, but they can also help you install it. They can talk about all those different compatibility issues
or present alternatives. If like the thing you were thinking may not be compatible, they can like help present alternatives and stuff.
Yes, absolutely. So go to your local bike shop. Different power meter considerations. You also have to see, and of course I brought it and then I totally lost it, but probably. So you have to have something to be, so now that you got the power meter, you have to have something to actually see it. I'll give you an example that I have on my person right now. So here's my Garmin watch, right? So you can actually see it on there. Apparently I've lost my head unit. It's probably in my backpack, maybe on the side pocket. Anyhow, you have to be able to actually see. So there's mine. I happen to have a Garmin. This is my head unit. It's small enough. You can see it compared to, my hand. It's small enough that, I can have this indoor training or outdoor training. I have it on both my bikes, but you have to have something to be able to read the power. You can't just have the power meter because
it doesn't like record it in itself and then you download it later. Like it has to, it's all it's doing is transmitting the data out. You just have to have something to catch that signal and then like that records the data.
Yes, correct. And this is what you would be seeing. I struggle with some, especially with my triathletes who put it on their watch, because then they're having to, from a safety perspective, they're having to look at their watch versus just having it displayed out in front. So just keep that in mind. You have to have, this is extra dollar bills. Just FYI.
But the nice thing is now, like a lot of the Garmin's, like there's the cheaper Garmin's that just like read like fewer data points, don't do mapping and stuff. So like if you already have like the watch and you literally just want it to be able to like look at your power and stuff, there are less expensive options. Like it's not like you're immediately in for $700.
No.
So there are other options.
So there's your head unit, and then just what I was saying before, like watch. We just happen to prefer Garmin because it talks to our software a little bit better, but there's other options on the market. Other things, how do you actually analyze this? So now that you have all the data, you're like, well, what the heck am I looking at, and what does it all mean? So this is when things like software come in. There are a bunch of different ones on the market. We happen to use a program called Today's Plan. It's an Australian company, and they worked with Team Sky, who is now a different team. But anyway, so a lot of like professional cycling teams. So they're very into, they're super data nerds, which is awesome. But there's also Training Peaks, there's Garmin, there's Best Bike Split that I already talked about, there's SRM, there's WKO, there's a ton of different ones on the market. There's Trainer Road, Strava, holy casmoles, there's a ton out there. So again, don't get too crazy with it. Try to stick with one and just be consistent. So then what does it all mean? How do you know what are your good numbers? Again, like we were saying, we want to compare apples to apples. first of all, gather as much data as you can, like ride with it as often as possible, get as much information as you can from yourself. Get out there and just ride, assuming that everything's working, because I've had athletes who ride and the batteries are dead. And then I'm like, okay, your power was not 34 for this whole ride. Like, what the heck is going on with that? Oh, I forgot. I forgot to charge my battery. That's another consideration. But gathering as much as you can. Put power into context by regularly doing some level of testing and or racing. So I'm assuming that when you're racing, you're very motivated, particularly short distance events. But testing is great. We obviously do it in our lab, and there's a number called FTP, which slightly irks me a little bit because it's not really a true scientific term, but we're not going to get into that here. But lactate threshold that is a true thing. And generally FTP and LT are aligned. So we use this in our testing facility, and that's kind of our basis. But just know that different protocols do not mean the same thing. So if you're doing a 20-minute protocol, that's what we happen to use. Then that should align with your 20-minute test that you do on a regular basis. If you're doing a 5-minute test, then, and I also use that as well, then you have apples to apples, right? If you're doing some, I think Trainer Road has like a ramp test. I mean, different
There's
programs.
a million different ways that people use to get like the FTP number. And I think your point just being like, make sure you're doing the same one each time. Like, don't do a 5-minute test this time, a 20-minute test this time, and like a ramp this time, because like you said, you're not comparing apples to apples anymore.
No, and then it just gets overwhelming and confusing. So make sure that you get that be consistent about your testing. So because and then obviously get feedback from the person who's testing you, from from a coach. Be careful about asking other athletes depending on their level of knowledge, and then comparison factor. It can be incredibly confusing. Important numbers to see real time, as I know that we're kind of running out of time. So this was my watch that I took. It's not real. It's not actually recording anything, but you can see there are 9 different data screens. Oops. And sorry if those numbers are not going to come up, but you can see time that I've got. I had a description here, but clearly that didn't work. Cadence, and I do say a note on this, safety first. If you're using this training outside, this is probably a little bit too much. Depends on the skill of the athlete, though. If you are comfortable on your bike and you can look down easily and know that you're not going to hit a pothole or hit the person in front of you or whatever, then use it, fine, but don't take your eyes off the road. But I use this for indoors. Heart rate, I want to see, that says power zone. This says heart rate zone. I want to know what lap I'm on, because this is a big mistake that my athletes make. I'll have them do an FTP test and they won't hit any laps. I can highlight the data and like look at it separately, but it's just kind of a pain in the butt. So make sure you hit the lap button. I just happen to,
if you're doing like intervals, like use the lap button. It keeps track for you.
Right.
And then it's just like, it's basically like bookmarking the start and end of each interval, so you don't have to like think about it, and like you don't have to go through later and like I think I started here and I think I ended here.
It's a crazy pain in my patushy. So hit your lap button. But then I want to see the actual power number. I am mostly focusing on the percent of FTP. That's a huge one for me as a coach. I want to see that this particular workout is done on average at 70% of your FTP. A lot of pace per, now it decides to work. Anyway, there's your total time, there's your lap time, and that was my little star. Make sure you got your power zone, your percent of FTP, your heart rate, and your heart rate zone. Because a lot of different workouts that at least I prescribe have a percent of FTP, particularly, I'll give you the example of a Tabata workout. I see people time and time again who don't work hard enough in a Tabata. Like, you are legit working your patushy off.
I mean,
it's
I think that's almost like one of the, like going back to like one of the early slides, like that's one of the benefits of power is like, I would say, at least from personal experience, one of the things you see is like people not working hard enough during their hard training periods and then working too hard on their easy training periods. Yep. And that's something power does for you, is it like lets you objectively see, I am working hard or I am not working hard. And then alternatively, when you're trying to have an easy day, it gives you like, do not cross this number if you're going to actually be staying easy.
Yep. And that, particularly since we do work with mostly triathletes, that is so common.
Yeah.
the majority of the time they're working too hard. And then when I ask them to work hard, they're not working hard enough. So that's really where it comes in. I don't know if David's on the line, but here you are, David. So important numbers to see real time, like when you're racing. Again, safety first. Don't be looking down when you need to be looking at the road. But talk about it with your coach, because, for example, I had one athlete in particular who was so obsessed with the numbers, he just couldn't get his eyes off of it. And I challenged him actually literally to have it covered the entire race. And so he wasn't allowed to look at it. It was recording, and that's fine, but he wasn't allowed to look at it.
Maybe that's a good candidate to collect it on their watch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So then that you're not looking at it. Know your personality. If you're super OCD, or if you're kind of a little bit more laid back, or if you just want one screen or two screens. I personally like to see total time. That doesn't necessarily have to be something that you look at as an athlete if you have a coach. But again, if you're racing, maybe you just want to see the raw number. If you have it reporting on a 10-second average or a 30-second average or whatever, it's going to fluctuate all the time. So again, maybe you just want average power spitting out at you. But again, that percent of FTP is my biggest thing from a training and racing perspective, because half Ironman needs to be at like 60 and maybe at the most 70% of FTP. Half Ironman 70, maybe at the highest 80% of FTP. And then Olympic distance can go up from there, and then even sprint can be 100 to maybe even 110% of FTP. So, but that's going to depend on your experience and you personally as the athlete. Heart rate, that's a nice piece. Sometimes you see that heart rate and you're like, man, I am like really worked up. I got to back it down a little bit. So having that, and also what heart rate zone you're in, because we're so heavily dependent on zones here. Cadence is also a nice thing. Like, oh man, I'm climbing this hill. My cadence is 40. Like maybe I should shift. So all of those are not necessarily required, but talk about it and don't get super tied up in the numbers. And again, safety first. So things to analyze later, and I'll kind of be quick here. Average power, if you're just starting out, that's a nice place to go. It's just average power per the interval and overall. It's a nice place. Like, start easy. There's something called normalized power. It's actually trademarked in today's plan. Yeah, in today's plan, they use weighted power, which takes out all of your coasting. Normalized power is almost always going to be higher than your average power. So that's another thing. And we'll get more into these in another webinar. But watts per kg, here's where you can get a little bit more into apples to apples. There's a reason why most pro cyclists are about as skinny as a stick, because they want that number to be as high as possible. They want their power to weight ratio to be as high as possible. Intensity factor, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but intensity factor is dependent on you making sure that your FTP number is correct, because then the other numbers kind of mean nothing. But this is how intense your workout was. How much at FTP or higher did you work out? It's kind of like as a percentage. So if your intensity factor was 1, you were working at 100%. That was pretty much all at FTP. It could have been solidly or up and down.
Above it and then below it. I don't know if we have ever had this conversation, but is that like the same thing as like Strava uses like training stress score or something? Is it like the same kind of idea?
No, that's different. Good question, Michael. So training stress is in essence like the total amount of load that you're applying and
so
how
like intensity plus volume.
Correct. Okay. So it's not just intensity, like intensity factor, but training stress score is their score for how hard you were going, but also how long you were going. So hypothetically, the higher the training stress, the harder the workout and the more recovery you'll need. I just had an athlete the other day who his heart rate zones were all kinds of whacked out and his training stress was way too high, but it wasn't really way too high. It was because technology. Anyway, so we will go more into this in another webinar video. Please give us feedback. If you want to leave something in the chat box or in the comments below, we want to know what you guys want to know so that we can report on that. But hopefully you can get into the land of power because it's stinking awesome. But take one step at a time. Don't get overwhelmed. Because when I went through and put my numbers, my screens in my Garmin, it took me at least 30 minutes.
My first Garmin that I got,
Holy
setting up the
camoly.
screens, I like literally sat and was just like watching TV, and I sat on the couch for an hour trying to figure out how to set everything
Because
up.
there's so much that you can put on there and so much crazy irrelevant stuff
Yeah.
that you can put on there.
So you can like change the number of data fields like on a Garmin, and you
Mhm.
can choose what each of the data fields are, and it's like there's a drop down list to choose from for like what you want the data field to be.
Yep.
And I'm like, I don't even know why I would want to see half of this
Yes.
stuff. It's
You
like
can put calories, you can
Yeah.
put average cadence,
Yeah.
you could, I mean, it's like you don't need to know all those different things
Yeah.
necessarily. It's just, it's overwhelming. And even in here, I have like the indoor version, the race version, the,
set
you
up
know,
differently.
I will have to say on that note, set your watches to auto pause, because I have that happen all the time to athletes. You know, we see this big, beautiful data and then like a giant hole in the middle. They're like, oh, I forgot to stop my watch, or, you know.
Yeah.
Or then I had one athlete unfortunately get hit by a car, and his watch was still going. So we saw him go all the way to the hospital.
Oh,
So
wow. At like
yeah,
60 miles an hour.
at like 60 miles an
Yeah.
hour. Yeah. So again, talk to your coach, talk to your friendly mechanic, take it one step at a time, get help, you know, and thank you. So get tested here. We've got opportunities for metabolic testing, and we've got opportunities to meet with me if you're overwhelmed by training. We do that all the time. So thank you for watching, and we will see you hopefully next week on a different topic. All right.